Trump was leaning towards escalation, and then after that, I think it's pretty clear he'd like to go in the other direction. Whereas for Netanyahu, war is good for him politically. It's just the opposite of Trump. He would like to be a wartime leader, when he's running for re-election. So I think he probably went in there and suggested to Trump that there were some benefits to escalation, but I don't think he pushed that very hard because I think he knows Trump's not going to do it.
Now, President Trump has had a series of important meetings at the White House today. He met Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the Oval Office at a time of some tension between the two leaders as the Iran war continues, with President Trump openly criticising Israel for continuing strikes in Lebanon during what was supposed to be a ceasefire. After the meeting, though, Benjamin Netanyahu told Israeli media the two had an understanding of a shared goal to ensure that Iran does not have nuclear weapons and other goals as well. He described it as one of the best conversations I've had with the President of the United States. The only other thing we've had on their meeting, though, was a photo of the two leaders smiling posted on X. Let's speak to Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy to the Middle East. Good evening to you, Frank.
Hi, how are you?
Very well. Delighted to have you with us. We've had the White House saying the talks between President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu were positive and productive. It's quite unusual that we haven't had more scenes of the two of them together, joint news conferences. Admittedly, they were on their way to this memorial service for Lindsey Graham. But what do you make of what we're hearing about their meeting?
Well, I think that the primary motivation for Netanyahu was his domestic politics. He's got an election campaign in 3 months, and he's trailing badly in the polls. So I think he's really trying to tout his relationship with Trump. I think that there were signals in between the lines from the White House that they didn't really want to do this meeting. It was difficult for the Israelis to schedule. And then obviously they didn't do the normal joint press conference that they would do. And that's because I think they really do have very different agendas here. Trump wants to wind down this war for a myriad of reasons. And Netanyahu would like to escalate if at all possible. So, yeah, I think that they have some common ground on preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. That's sort of the lowest common denominator. But beyond that, I think we have very different agendas at this point.
So you talk about the differences between them. And President Trump's desire to actually bring the war to a close. I mean, we saw, 13, 14 nights of very heavy strikes on Iranian targets. Since then, several days of what's been described as a pause. What do you make of how President Trump is approaching this and the difference there between how the Israeli leader sees it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's very difficult, of course, for anybody to really speculate on what Trump's motivations are because, he changes his mind quite a bit. I think what he did realize in that 14 days of bombing was that there really wasn't any way to bomb Iran into accepting his conditions, even when it comes to opening the Strait of Hormuz. And I think he had a meeting that was pretty well publicized last Friday with White House a senior team in which they said, basically, we don't have enough interceptors to protect all of our troops. A bombing campaign is not going to change Iran's calculus. It could crater the entire global economy, and it's going to kill you politically. So I think Trump was leaning towards escalation, and then after that, I think it's pretty clear he'd like to go in the other direction. Whereas for Netanyahu, war is good for him politically. It's just the opposite of Trump. He would like to be a wartime leader, when he's running for re-election. So I think he probably went in there and suggested to Trump that there were some benefits to escalation, but I don't think he pushed that very hard because I think he knows Trump's not going to do it. I think what Netanyahu would settle for, which could be the sort of common ground, is that the war never ends, but it doesn't really resume either. So it's a state of semi-war for an indefinite period of time, and Netanyahu can hope always that he has an opportunity to escalate. I think that's more or less where this wound up.
We've just had a new report on this in the Times here in London, saying that Benjamin Netanyahu urged President Trump not to abandon regime change in Tehran, saying that the conflict can only end with the fall of the regime in Iran or a clear change of course. But that really seems to have fallen right off President Trump's agenda.
Yeah, well, the problem with that is that Netanyahu sold him on that idea at the beginning of the war, and it didn't work. They had some scheme to get Ahmadinejad to take power, and it never had any chance of working. So I think Trump and his senior staff are pretty wary of Netanyahu's, suggestions with respect to regime change. I think his broader agenda there was, as I said before, just to keep the war going. If he keeps telling Trump, hey, there's a possibility for regime change here, because that's never going to happen, the war will never end. And Netanyahu will remain a wartime leader politically and keep open the possibility that the United States will ramp up the strikes down the road. I think that's really where he was hoping this would end.
And I'm looking at how Benjamin Netanyahu was asked by Fox News what it would take to end the war, and Netanyahu mentioned Iranian regime change several times, despite President Trump now seem to be saying that this is not actually a war goal.
Yeah, it's not a realistic war goal. It's a sort of a fever dream of Netanyahu's going back, 30 years. But I think Trump has finally realized, especially after this last round of bombing, that trying to force the Iranian regime to capitulate, let alone change the regime itself through air power, is simply not a viable option. There's no real world chance that that's going to happen, right? And so I think Trump has quickly, you might have thought that at the beginning of the war, but now he's definitely changed his goals. He'd like to just open the Strait of Hormuz. That would be Trump's war goal at this point, and prevent the global economy, from cratering, and also not be stuck with this sense that the war with the United States in a much worse position than it was, because obviously the strait was open before the war. But that's a very, very different goal than regime change. I don't think anybody in the United States, certainly in the government, thinks regime change is a realistic proposition at this point.
What do you make of those reports that suggested one reason why the US bombing attacks have been paused is because US forces were running low on some munitions and missiles and so on?
Yeah, I think it's completely credible, and that there have been leaks along those lines from J.D. Vance, from Kane, the Joint Chiefs of Staff chair, and it's because we used a lot of interceptors protecting Israel in this war, but also we have troops stationed all throughout the region. There's civilian embassies that we have to protect, and basically we're very spread out. And it was okay for a limited period of time. We could sort of protect everything that needed to be protected, but we don't have enough munitions, especially if the war were to go on for 2 or 3 more weeks or even months. So at that point, we're looking at significant U.S. casualties, which is really the last thing on earth Trump wants to do. So I think if there was one thing that was the final nail in the coffin of a massive escalation campaign for Trump, it was the fact that it was going to result in significant U.S. casualties, and that's a risk he wasn't willing to take.
This whole war has been a miscalculation by President Trump, hasn't it? I mean, you talked about the fact that his goal now is just to try to get the Strait of Hormuz open. The Iranians have clearly realised that the greatest leverage that they've got is simply that they can carry out attacks, perhaps pretty low-level ones, on certain tankers, and that will be enough to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz is not open. And it's very difficult indeed to see how President Trump gets out of this.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I think what Trump is finally realizing is there really is no military way to open up the Strait of Hormuz, just given the geography of the place. It just takes a couple of guys in a drone to slow down traffic. And remember, you're talking about the slowest moving ships in the world with the world's most flammable material, right? So it's really not hard to deter them from moving through the strait rather. And so I think what Trump has finally understood is that there's going to have to be some kind of a diplomatic solution to this. They may have to find a way to allow Iran to collect tolls in some form or another. And that is a strategic setback for the United States. There's really no question about it. If you look at the beginning of this war, the Strait of Hormuz was open and Iran was willing to make major concessions on its nuclear program. And now at the end of this war, we have a major new strategic asset for the Iranians they didn't have before that they can utilize as far as the eye can see. And there's been no progress whatsoever on the nuclear file. So as to what Trump says, the good thing or what Trump will do on this is he'll say whatever he wants. He'll just declare victory and move on. He's been saying a lot of things that aren't really true, over and over and over again. And some small portion, 30% of the U.S. population, believes everything he says, and nobody else believes anything he says. So at some point, he's just going to talk to his people and declare whatever he wants to declare and move on. So the inconsistency and the strategic outcome here are not things that are a particular problem for Trump.
Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy to the Middle East. Really great to get your insight. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having me.